Hello everyone, welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm thrilled to have you here today. We've got an incredible story lined up for you, full of tough decisions, self-discovery, and the challenges of navigating life's big moments. Follow along as Ethan faces a turning point between staying loyal to his family or fighting for a cause he believes in. It's going to be an amazing journey, and I can't wait to dive into it with you. Let's light up your English learning experience. Let's get started. Chapter 1: The Unexpected Call. It was a typical afternoon. Ethan was sitting in his room, sprawled on his bed with a book he wasn't really reading. His mind was somewhere else, lost in thoughts about the summer he had been hoping for. The weather was perfect for surfing, and he had been planning to spend his days on the beach with his best friend Lucas. It was supposed to be their time. But now, just a week before they were meant to leave for their beach holiday, Lucas had Ethan sighed as he stared out the window. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and all he wanted to do was feel the salt water on his skin and the wind in his hair. Instead, he was stuck in the house with nothing to do. What am I supposed to do now? The phone rang, breaking his chain of thoughts. He ignored it, letting it ring out. Then it rang again, and Ethan thought about answering it. But he wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone. He didn't want to explain himself to his parents or deal with anyone else's expectations. It was supposed to be his time to relax, not to deal with issues. He lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. Why did Lucas have to cancel? He muttered to himself. He was supposed to be my summer buddy. Now it's just me, just as Ethan was about to roll over and try to focus on his book again. The phone rang a third time. This time, something made him pick up the receiver. He wasn't sure why, but the urgency in the ring caught his attention. "Hello?" Ethan answered, trying to mask the annoyance in his voice. "Hey, is this Ethan?" A cheerful voice responded from the other end. "Yeah," Ethan said, sitting up now, his curiosity piqued. "Hey, Ethan, it's Uncle Frank from the countryside." Ethan paused. Uncle Frank. He hadn't spoken to his uncle in months. "Oh, hi, Uncle Frank," Ethan replied, his tone softening. "How are you?" "Doing well, doing well." "I've got a favor to ask," Uncle Frank said. Ethan's interest grew. "I broke my wrist yesterday and things are a bit hectic around here. We need some extra hands on the farm. I was wondering if you could come help us out for a bit this summer. It'll only be for a few weeks, and we could use the help." Ethan's stomach sank. The last thing he wanted was to go work on a farm. He had been dreaming of surfing all summer. "I don't know, Uncle Frank," he said, trying to hide his disappointment. "I had some plans and they kind of fell through." Uncle Frank chuckled on the other end of the line. I get it. You were probably planning to spend the summer by the sea, right? But here's the deal. We could really use you here. I'll pay you, of course. You'd get a break from all this city life, and you could even catch a few waves when you're free. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't want to go, but he also didn't want to let his uncle down. "I mean, I really wanted to surf this summer. I was supposed to be on the beach, not picking vegetables." "You don't have to decide right now," Uncle Frank said, understanding Ethan's hesitation. Think it over, talk to your mom, and let me know. You don't have to make a decision today. Ethan wasn't sure what to do. Okay, I'll think about it, he replied reluctantly. That night, when his mom came home from work, she immediately noticed Ethan's glum mood. "What's the matter, love?" she asked, walking into the kitchen. I'm bummed about the holiday," Ethan said, stirring his cereal with a spoon. "Lucas bailed on me. I don't know what I'm going to do this summer." His mom sat down across from him. "Oh no, that's rough. Did you talk to him?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he's going with his girlfriend. So, now I'm stuck here, alone." His mom raised an eyebrow. "Well, you know who called today? Your Uncle Frank. He broke his wrist and needs help on the farm. He wants you to come work for him for a few weeks." Ethan groaned, not wanting to talk about it. "I know, Mom, but I really don't want to work on a farm. It's not what I had planned." "Sweetheart, you'll get fresh air, good food, and you'll have time to surf when you're not working," his mom said, trying to convince him. "It might be a nice change of pace. Plus, you don't have any other plans, do you?" Ethan looked down at his cereal, feeling conflicted. He had been looking forward to his surf holiday with Lucas for so long, but now it seemed like that dream was slipping away. "I guess I don't have much of a choice," he said, letting out a long sigh. His mom smiled. "I think you should go. It might not be what you imagined, but you can still make the most of it." The next morning, Ethan sat in the kitchen, staring out the window. The sun was shining, and the beach was calling his name. But his mind kept going, back to his conversation with his uncle. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. "Okay, I'll go," he said suddenly. "I'll go help Uncle Frank on the farm. I'll make it work." "Good choice," his mom said. "It'll be an adventure, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it once you're there. Plus, you can always surf on your days off." Ethan wasn't convinced, but he knew deep down that he had made the right choice. Maybe this summer would still have some surprises in store after all. And so, a few days later, Ethan found himself on the road, heading toward his uncle's farm. As he drove, the thought of the farm and the peaceful countryside settled in his mind. It wasn't the holiday he had planned, but maybe, just maybe, it would turn out to be something special after all. But as Ethan drove further into the countryside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to experience something far different from the life he had known. Something that would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine, and that was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Journey to the Farm. The morning of Ethan's departure arrived sooner than he expected. The decision had been made, and now it was time to follow through. He wasn't thrilled about it, but he had agreed to go. After a quick breakfast, he packed his things, a few pairs of clothes, his surfboard, just in case, and a book or two for the quiet evenings he imagined he would spend on the farm. The plan was simple: work on the farm for a few weeks, help out Uncle Frank, and then, if he was lucky, find some time to surf. As he loaded his bags into his car, Ethan glanced at the beach gear one last time, but the excitement he had once felt about the beach now seemed distant. The ocean could wait. Ethan's mother waved him off as he started the engine. "Have a good trip, honey. Call me when you get there." He nodded, giving her a thumbs up before pulling out of the driveway and heading toward the main road. The town was quiet as he left, the morning still cool, but it wasn't long before the sounds of the city were replaced by the hum of tires against the road. The drive to Uncle Frank's farm was going to take a couple of hours. The initial part of the journey was fairly straightforward, following the highway to the outskirts of town. But as Ethan ventured deeper into the countryside, the roads grew narrower, winding through tall trees and rolling hills. He couldn't help but notice how much the landscape changed with every turn. The constant bustle of the city was behind him now. All that was ahead of him was open countryside and the quiet, unhurried pace of rural life. Ethan drove through small villages, past fields dotted with sheep and cows. The peacefulness of the surroundings was refreshing, but still, something gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about the beach, about the surfing holiday that had slipped through his fingers. This was not what he had imagined for the summer. After a while, Ethan's thoughts turned to Uncle Frank's offer. The farm, a place far removed from the chaotic, surf-filled world he had envisioned. Uncle Frank was kind, sure, but Ethan wasn't sure he was cut out for farm work. He had spent most of his life in the city, and though he liked the idea of nature, he had never really been exposed to the rural lifestyle. "Maybe it won't be so bad," Ethan muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that it was a temporary diversion. "I'll help out. Then I can go home and get back to surfing. No big deal." But as the road stretched on, his mind kept drifting to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Ethan tried to shake it off. The sooner he got there, the sooner he could settle into the routine and make the most of it. The final stretch of the journey took him along a narrow country lane, the type of road that felt like it belonged to another world. Tall hedgerows lined the way, and the occasional farmhouse peeked out from behind the trees. Ethan had been following this road for nearly 30 minutes when he remembered Uncle Frank's instructions. "Take the road across Bodmin Moor. It's a bit longer, but you'll get a beautiful view of the sea from the top." Ethan wasn't sure what to expect, but the idea of a scenic route intrigued him. He veered off the main road and followed the smaller track that wound its way up the hills. The higher he climbed, the more spectacular the view became. He rolled down his window and breathed in the fresh air. It smelled different here, cleaner, more earthy. It felt like he was getting closer to something real, something he hadn't known he needed. From the top of Bodmin Moor, the landscape stretched out before him like a painting, a patchwork of green fields and winding roads. The sky was an endless blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds, and in the distance he could see the glint of the sea shimmering under the sunlight. Ethan stopped the car for a moment, getting out to take it all in. He stood there for a while, just breathing, letting the view soak in. It was beautiful, he couldn't deny that. As he continued on his way, the scenery started to change again. The peaceful hills gave way to darker clouds as he neared the coast. The wind picked up, and a chill swept through the air, making him pull his jacket tighter around himself. For a moment, he thought the weather was turning for the worse, but Then, just as quickly as it had come, the clouds parted. And there it was, like a treasure waiting to be discovered. Fistel Beach. It wasn't just a beach. It was the beach. The one Ethan had heard so much about. The legendary surf spot that attracted surfers from all over. The golden sand stretched endlessly along the shore, and the waves crashed with a rhythm that seemed to call out to him. Ethan stopped the car and stared out at the water for a moment, his heart racing with excitement. He could already see the surfers out there, carving through the waves like it was second nature. It made his pulse quicken, and for a second he almost thought about turning the car around and heading straight for the beach. But he knew he couldn't. Not today. He reluctantly turned away from the beach, following the road that would lead him to Uncle Frank's farm. The next landmark was the turnoff to Tronen Farm. Ethan took a deep breath, his excitement turning to unease as he approached. The small gate with the sign that read, Tronen Farm. He pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel. The farmhouse came into view, a modest white building nestled between fields. Uncle Frank and Aunt Jenny were waiting for him outside, waving. As Ethan parked the car and got out, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the isolation settling in. There were no other houses around, no bustling town center or busy beach, just the farm, the wind, and the silence of the countryside. "Hey, Ethan," Uncle Frank greeted him, his warm smile helping Ethan relax a little. "Glad you made it. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we'll make it fun." Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, thanks for having me." His aunt came forward, giving him a hug. "You're looking taller every time we see you," she said, stepping back to look him over. Ethan chuckled, trying to adjust to the farm life. Looking. Around he saw only rolling hills and green fields, no other houses, no surfboards, nothing but the quiet. For a second, he felt like he might be out of his element, but then Uncle Frank clapped him on the back and said, "Come on inside. You must be starving." Ethan followed them into the farmhouse, where the smell of a home-cooked meal greeted him. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until he stepped inside. But as the door closed behind him, the thought of the ocean lingered in the back of his mind, a quiet reminder of the holiday he had planned but never got to experience. And so began Ethan's stay at Tronen Farm, an unexpected adventure that would take him far beyond what he had ever imagined. Chapter 3. Settling in. Ethan's first few days on Tronen Farm felt like a blur. When he woke up in the mornings, the familiar sounds of city life, car horns, street noise, and the hum of traffic were replaced by the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of sheep bleating in the fields. The air was fresher here, cleaner. Every breath felt like it was filling his lungs with something new, something unfamiliar but somehow refreshing. The farm was surrounded by rolling hills, far away from the crowded streets and busy buildings he was used to. The farmhouse was quaint, cozy in a way that felt both inviting and unfamiliar. It had a wood-burning stove in the kitchen, shelves lined with jars of homemade jam and pickles, and a small dining table where his aunt and uncle sat every night for dinner. Everything was simple here, no distractions, no rush, just the rhythm of farm life. Ethan couldn't help but feel out of place. He'd been told that the first few days would be filled with hard work, but nothing could have prepared him for how tiring it would be. The morning started early, with Uncle Frank calling out to him from the kitchen, where he was already preparing breakfast. Ethan, still groggy from a restless sleep, stumbled out of bed and into the kitchen, where his aunt served him a hearty meal of eggs, toast, and freshly brewed coffee. The food was different, simpler, and yet more satisfying than anything he'd had in the city. It felt like the kind of food that could fuel a whole day of hard work. "Big day ahead of you, Ethan," Uncle Frank said as he passed Ethan a plate. "We've got vegetables to pick, some repairs to do around the barn, and plenty of other little jobs. But don't worry, we'll take it easy the first day." Ethan nodded, not sure what to expect. He had never worked on a farm before, and the thought of spending his days picking vegetables, fixing fences, and doing manual labor seemed far from the adventure he had envisioned. The more he thought about it, the more he regretted not going on his surfing trip. After breakfast, Uncle Frank led Ethan outside, where the morning sun was already starting to warm the air. They walked across the farmyard, where Ethan could see the field stretching out before him, divided by neat rows of crops and bordered by high hedgerows. There were animals to care for, sheep to shear, chickens to feed, and the occasional horse that needed attention. But the first task of the day was to head out to the vegetable patches. The ground was soft and damp from the previous night's rain, and as Ethan bent down to pick the first batch of carrots, he felt his back ache from the unfamiliar position. "This is nothing like surfing," he thought, feeling the weight of the farm's demands. Uncle Frank worked alongside him, showing him the best way to pull the carrots from the earth without damaging them. "You're doing great, Ethan," Uncle Frank said with a smile, his voice warm and encouraging. "It takes a little time to get used to it, but once you've done it for a while, it becomes second nature. Just relax and enjoy the process. You'd be surprised how peaceful it is out here." Ethan smiled weakly, but didn't reply. His mind was elsewhere. The rows of vegetables seemed endless, and the repetitive motion of bending over, pulling up crops, and tossing them into baskets was starting to make him feel like he was stuck in a never-ending loop. He glanced up at the sky, hoping for some sign that the day might bring something exciting. But all he saw were the same hills, the same fields, the same peaceful quiet that was starting to feel suffocating. By mid-afternoon, they had filled several baskets with carrots, potatoes, and onions. The sun had warmed the earth, and the quietness of the farm was beginning to settle in Ethan's bones. He was covered in dirt, his hands were sore from working, and his legs felt like they might give out any moment. Still, there was something strangely satisfying about the work. "We'll take a break soon," Uncle Frank said, noticing Ethan's exhaustion. "You've done well for your first day. I think you're starting to get the hang of it." Ethan wasn't so sure, but he didn't argue. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. There was a peacefulness to it all that Ethan hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the excitement of the beach, but it was something else entirely, something quieter, slower, and more grounded. After a short break, they moved on to another task, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs. Ethan had never been this close to animals before. He had seen them from a distance, of course, but standing next to the chickens, feeding them, and collecting their eggs was an entirely new experience. It was simple work, but it brought a sense of connection to the land and to the animals that Ethan hadn't expected. Later, after a quick dinner, Ethan sat outside the farmhouse on the porch, looking out over the fields as the evening settled. And the house felt quiet, peaceful, but still, a part of him longed for the hustle and bustle of the city. He thought about the beach again, the sound of the waves crashing, the feeling of the surfboard beneath him, the thrill of catching the perfect wave. But here, all he had was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant bleat of the sheep in the fields. Uncle Frank came out and sat next to him, offering him a mug of tea. "I know it's not what you had in mind for your summer," he said, his voice kind and understanding. "But I appreciate you being here. It helps more than you know." Ethan looked at his uncle, nodding silently. "I'll get used to it," he said, trying to sound positive. The truth was, he didn't know if he would. As the evening grew darker and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Ethan couldn't help but feel a little more at peace. The farm wasn't the adventure he had planned, but it was still something new, something different. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to appreciate it in its own way. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. He stretched and sat up, the early light streaming through the curtains. It was a new day, and although he wasn't fully ready to embrace it, he knew it was time to start making the best of it. The farm was quiet and calm, but for the first time, Ethan wasn't so sure that was a bad thing. With a deep breath, he got out of bed, ready to face whatever the day would bring. Maybe the surf would have to wait for now, but there was work to be done, and for the first time, Ethan felt ready to take it on. Chapter 4. Meeting Sophie. The first few days on the farm felt like an endless blur of work. Every morning, Uncle Frank and Aunt Jenny had Ethan up before sunrise, helping with everything from picking vegetables to feeding the animals. It was hard work, no doubt about it. But as much as Ethan hated to admit it, he was starting to get used to it. He wasn't quite sure how it had happened, but something about the slow pace of farm life had begun to settle into his routine. The aches in his back from bending over all day became a little less noticeable, and the quiet of the countryside no longer felt as oppressive. But while Ethan was adjusting to the rhythm of the farm, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was missing. The whole point of being here, at least in his mind, was to surf. Yet, with every day that passed, that dream seemed further and further out of reach. One afternoon, after spending hours stacking hay bales and fixing the fence near the barn, Ethan decided to take a break. The sun was low in the sky, and he could feel the heat beginning to dissipate. The quiet of the farm was nice, but he longed for something more, something exciting. Surfing. He knew he couldn't leave yet, not after promising his uncle and aunt he would help out for the summer. But still, the desire to be on a surfboard, feeling the rush of the waves, never really went away. Ethan walked down to the nearby town of Nuki. It wasn't far, just a few miles down a country lane, but it was enough of a change in scenery to give him a break from the farm. Nuki was a small town, a quiet place with winding streets and little shops lining both sides. Ethan had only been there a couple of times since arriving, but every time he went, he noticed more surfers walking around, more surf shops filling the streets. The whole town seemed to revolve around the beach. As he walked past a row of surf shops, one of them caught his eye. The sign out front read, Nuki Surf Emporium. Inside, the store was packed with surfboards of every size and shape, wetsuits, hanging from hooks, and racks filled with gear for anyone serious about surfing. Ethan couldn't resist. He stepped inside, the scent of wax and salt water filling his nostrils as he browsed the shelves. He was so absorbed in checking out a new set of surf fins that he didn't notice the girl standing next to him until she spoke. "Looking for something new?" she asked, her voice friendly and easygoing. Ethan turned and saw a girl about his age, with long, sun-bleached hair and a confident, easy smile. She had a pair of sunglasses resting on top of her head and wore a light, flowy shirt paired with board shorts, an outfit that screamed surfer. Yeah," Ethan said, a little startled but quickly recovering. "Just looking around?" The girl nodded, glancing at the board he was holding. "Nice board. Are you new around here?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before replying. "Yeah, I'm staying on a farm just outside of town. Uncle Frank's place." "Uncle Frank, huh? That's cool. I'm Sophie," she said, extending a hand. "I work here part-time, just helping out with the shop when I'm not at the beach." Ethan shook her hand, his interest piqued. "Nice to meet you, Sophie. I'm Ethan." "Ethan, huh? What's a guy like you doing working on a farm?" Sophie asked with a raised eyebrow, clearly amused. Ethan let out a small laugh, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't exactly planning on it. My friend bailed on a surfing trip, and I thought I'd help my uncle for the summer. Not exactly what I had in mind, though." Sophie smiled sympathetically. "Yeah, I get that. The farm life isn't for everyone, but you're in the right place if you're looking for some surf. We've got the best beaches here." She paused for a moment, her smile turning slightly mischievous. "If you ever get tired of farm work, maybe I can show you some of the good surf spots." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. The thought of someone actually showing him around the surf spots sounded like exactly what he needed. He had seen surfers out on the waves in the distance, but it had been too crowded, too overwhelming to even try to get out there on his own. "That sounds awesome," Ethan said, trying to mask the excitement in his voice. "I'd really appreciate that." Sophie's eyes lit up. "I'll take you to Fistel Beach next weekend. You've got a board, right?" "Yeah, I do. It's in my car." "Well, perfect. We'll catch some waves," she said, grinning. "I can show you the ropes. Maybe you can teach me a thing or two if you're good." Ethan laughed. "I'm no expert, but I've been surfing for a few years. I'll do my best." Sophie smiled, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt the weight of his summer plans lighten. Maybe the farm wasn't such a bad place after all. "I'll see you on Saturday then," Sophie said, picking up a surfboard and setting it against the wall. "But for now, You better get back to that farm before Uncle Frank comes looking for you." Ethan nodded, grabbing his stuff and heading for the door. But before he left, Sophie called after him. "Hey, Ethan," he turned around, curious. "Don't work too hard on the farm. Life's too short, you know. Make sure you enjoy the surf, too." He grinned at her, feeling a warmth that had been missing ever since he arrived at the farm. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Sophie." As Ethan stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, he felt a new sense of excitement bubbling inside him. For the first time since arriving on the farm, he wasn't thinking about the work that awaited him, or the fact that he had been dragged into this rural life against his will. He was thinking about the surf. He was thinking about Fistel Beach. For the first time in days, he had something to look forward to. As Ethan made his way back to the farm, the horizon ahead looked a little brighter, a little more promising. Maybe the farm wasn't so bad after all. And maybe, just maybe, this summer was going to be a lot more exciting than he had originally thought. Chapter 5. The Protest. The days that followed were a mix of work, small conversations with Aunt Jenny, and long stretches of quiet in the countryside. Ethan had settled into his routine on the farm, the hard work becoming a little less overwhelming with each passing day. Yet despite the familiarity of the farm life, a part of him still longed for the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the salty air, the thrill of riding the perfect wave, those were the things that filled his mind during his quiet moments. But on a Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Ethan had just finished stacking the last of the hay bales in the barn when Aunt Jenny called out to him from the back door of the farmhouse. "Ethan, can you come here for a minute?" He wiped his brow, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked toward the back of the house. Aunt Jenny was standing near the garden gate, her expression serious. "There's something I need to talk to you about," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. Ethan's stomach sank. He could tell that something was off. "What's going on?" he asked, worried. "It's about the protest," she said, glancing toward the hills in the distance. "There's a group that's been coming through here recently. They're protesting the genetically modified crops down by the Latix farm. They're calling for a boycott, and they've been marching through the village handing out flyers." Ethan frowned. "A protest? What do they want?" Aunt Jenny sighed. "They're upset because of the GM crops near Tronan Farm. They think it's dangerous that the pollen could cross-contaminate the organic crops. Some of them even want to destroy the GM crops." Ethan's mind immediately flashed to Anna, and the words she had spoken about the GM crops being a threat to the natural plants. He had only heard snippets of what she thought about the Latix farm, but now it was all making sense. Anna had mentioned the protests, but Ethan hadn't taken them seriously at the time. "So what does this mean for us?" Ethan asked. "We're not the only ones around here who are concerned," Aunt Jenny replied. "Some people feel so strongly about it that they've taken things too far. They've started vandalizing the Latix farm's crops, and there's talk of more destruction. It's getting messy, Ethan." Ethan felt uneasy. He knew that the GM crops were controversial, but he hadn't realized how much tension they were causing in the community. He also didn't realize that the protesters had become so radical. I don't want you getting involved in this, Aunt Jenny said, her voice firm but with a trace of worry. It's not worth it. People are getting riled up and things are getting out of hand. Ethan nodded. I understand, but what do you think about it? He had to ask. After all, this was his aunt and uncle's farm. They were the ones who were most at risk if the protests escalated. Aunt Jenny paused, thinking carefully. We've worked hard to make this farm what it is. We've been organic for years, and we believe in what we're doing. But we can't ignore the fact that there's a growing threat from the Lattics farm. If their GM crops cross-pollinate with ours, it could ruin everything we've worked for. Ethan could hear the worry in her voice. So, you're worried about the crops? It's more than that, Aunt Jenny admitted. It's about the future of the farm. If the Lattics farm continues with these crops, it's going to affect everyone around here. It's not just us, it's the whole community. And now, with these protests, it's only getting worse. Ethan stood in silence for a moment, trying to process everything his aunt had just said. It was hard to imagine the peaceful countryside he had grown to appreciate suddenly turning into a battleground over crops. He thought about the people in town, the surfers, the farmers, and the protesters. It was clear that not everyone saw the issue the same way, and tensions were rising. Later that afternoon, after some quiet time, Ethan decided to head into town. He wanted to understand more about the protests and see for himself what was going on. As he drove down the winding road toward Nuki, he felt a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he needed to know more. When he arrived in town, it wasn't hard to find the protest. A group of people was marching through the main square, carrying signs that read, "Stop GM Crops" and "Save Our Future." The crowd was diverse, some older people, some younger, some families, and others clearly passionate about their cause. The protesters were peaceful, but there was an intensity in the air that made Ethan feel uncomfortable. He hadn't expected this to be so serious. Ethan stood on the sidelines watching from a distance. He felt torn between the two sides. He understood the concerns about the environment, but he also knew how hard his aunt and uncle had worked to build their organic farm. Could the protesters be right? Could GM crops truly harm the organic crops around here? He didn't have all the answers, but he felt a growing unease as he watched the protest unfold. As the crowd continued to march, Ethan spotted a familiar face among the protesters. It was Anna. Her face was determined, but her eyes seemed distant, almost unfocused as she carried a sign in front of her. Ethan hesitated for a moment, not sure whether to approach her or stay where he was. He had mixed feelings about her. She was passionate, yes, but sometimes it felt like her beliefs were all-consuming. He didn't know where he stood on the Bois issue, but he knew he didn't want to get caught up in anything that could lead to more violence. Before he could decide what to do, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Sophie standing behind him, her expression thoughtful. "You here for the protest too?" Sophie asked, glancing at the crowd. Ethan shrugged. "Just wanted to see what's going on. Things are getting pretty intense." He glanced back at Anna, who was now standing near the front of the crowd, holding her sign high. Sophie followed his gaze. "Yeah, it's getting out of hand. People here feel really strongly about GM crops, but not everyone agrees. Some people are even taking it too far, like those who want to destroy the crops. She shook her head. I get it, I do, but violence isn't the answer. Ethan nodded, feeling conflicted. I don't know. It's hard to know what to think. I mean, my aunt and uncle are worried about the GM crops, and they're the ones who've been working the land for years. But I don't know if destroying someone's crops is the right way to go about it. Sophie gave him a sympathetic look. It's not easy, but you have to remember, things like this can divide people. It's all about finding a balance, protecting the environment and the land, but also respecting each other's livelihoods. Ethan stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. He had always thought of protests as loud and rebellious, but this one felt different. The people here weren't just angry, they were afraid. Afraid of losing something they cared about, just like his aunt and uncle were. As the protest wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Sophie looked at Ethan. You should talk to Anna. She's really passionate about this. But just remember, it's not just black and white. People see things differently. Ethan hesitated, watching Anna as she walked off toward the edge of the crowd. Part of him wanted to follow her, to understand where she was coming from. But another part of him wasn't sure if it was worth the confrontation. I'll think about it, he said finally. Thanks, Sophie. As Ethan made his way back to the car, he realized that things had changed. The peaceful farm life he had settled into was now filled with tension. The protest had opened his eyes to the deeper conflicts simmering beneath the surface of the community. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, but he knew one thing for certain. Things were about to get even more complicated. Chapter 6. Conflicting Loyalties. The days following the protest were tense. The once peaceful rhythms of farm life on Tronan Farm had been shattered by the protests against the GM crops, and Ethan found himself caught between two sides that seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile. He had always thought of life as a bit more straightforward, right or wrong, black or white. But the longer he stayed on the farm, the more he realized that life wasn't as simple as it seemed. And now, with the protests and the tensions between the organic farmers and the Laddox family, everything felt more complicated than ever. Ethan spent the following day working alongside Uncle Frank in the vegetable fields, but his thoughts kept drifting. As much as he tried to focus on the tasks at hand, his mind would always wander back to the protest. He thought about Anna, how passionate she was about the GM crops, and how resolutely she believed in what she was doing. But he also couldn't ignore the way his aunt and uncle felt. They had worked tirelessly to create Tronan Farm, to make it a successful, thriving organic farm. To them, the possibility of GM crops contaminating their fields felt like a personal threat. Ethan couldn't help but understand that fear. They were protecting their livelihood, their future. But then there was Sophie. Sophie, who had shown him around the surf shops and encouraged him to get out on the water. Sophie, who had a more balanced approach to the whole issue, acknowledging both sides of the debate. She had told him the truth, that things were getting out of hand and people were being radical, but there had to be a way to find balance. Later that afternoon, as Ethan walked back to the farmhouse, he found himself staring at the fence that divided the fields. The sight of it, straight and neat but separating everything on the farm, felt oddly symbolic. He had spent days on the farm, trying to adjust to this slower, quieter life, but now it felt as though he too was standing between two worlds. The world of his aunt and uncle, with their organic farm and quiet lifestyle, and the world of Anna and the protesters, who believed in fighting for what they saw as the right cause. He didn't know where he fit in anymore. As Ethan approached the house, he saw Aunt Jenny sitting on the porch, reading a book, her face tired but peaceful. Ethan sat beside her, feeling a familiar weight in his chest. His thoughts were swirling, and he needed someone to talk to. "Aunt Jenny," Ethan said, his voice hesitating at first, "can I ask you something?" She looked up from her book, her face softening as she smiled at him. "Of course, Ethan. What's on your mind?" "It's about the protests," he began. "I'm not really sure what to think anymore. I mean, I get that the GM crops are a big deal, and I understand why you and Uncle Frank are worried. But the protesters, they're so passionate about this, and Anna, she's really convinced that it's something we need to fight against. I just don't know what to believe." Aunt Jenny closed the book slowly, as if considering his words. She set it aside and turned toward him, her gaze kind but firm. "I understand how you feel. It's not an easy issue to resolve. I think sometimes people get so caught up in their beliefs that they forget there are people on the other side who are just as scared, just as uncertain. The protesters, they see this as a way of protecting the land, and I get that. But we're not just talking about crops here, Ethan. We're talking about everything we've built. The farm, the food we grow, the life we've created here. It's all tied to what we believe in." Ethan nodded, taking it all in. He had heard this from his aunt before, but this time it felt different. He understood now that his aunt wasn't just defending her crops. She was defending the life she and Uncle Frank had built together. This farm wasn't just a business to them, it was their life. "I get it," Ethan said, though his voice was thick with uncertainty. "But I also get what Anna's saying. She thinks it's a fight for the future, that if we don't stop these GM crops now, it'll be too late. She's convinced it's wrong for the environment, and it's hard to ignore her when she believes so strongly in it." Aunt Jenny sighed and shook her head. "I know Anna believes she's doing the right thing. She's young, and she's passionate. But that passion can cloud her judgment. The truth is, there's a lot we don't know about GM crops, but there's also a lot we don't know about the future if we don't embrace new technologies. We can't just close our eyes and pretend the world is the same as it was 50 years ago. Change happens, and we have to adapt." Ethan felt torn between his aunt's grounded wisdom and Anna's fiery conviction. It was hard to see them both as right, but in his heart, he knew they both had valid points. There was no clear answer, just a lot of noise, a lot of fear, and a lot of uncertainty. It was the kind of situation that made him want to just walk away from it all and go back to the beach, where things felt simpler. "I don't know what to do, Aunt Jenny," Ethan admitted, his voice soft. "I don't know where I stand on all of this." Aunt Jenny placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "That's okay, Ethan. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes the hardest thing is realizing that there isn't one simple answer. But it's important to listen to both sides, to try and understand where people are coming from. And then, when the time comes, you make your decision. It doesn't have to be right or wrong. It just has to be what feels true to you." Ethan sat in silence for a while, letting his aunt's words sink in. It was the kind of advice that didn't make things easier, but somehow made it okay to not have everything figured out. He didn't have to pick a side right away. He could take his time and listen, learn, and then decide for himself what mattered most. Later that evening, after a long day of work, Ethan went for a walk. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a pale orange sky, and the cool evening air was refreshing. He walked along the edge of the fields, his thoughts still swirling. His mind kept returning to Anna and Sophie, the two people who had shown him different sides of the issue. Anna, passionate and fierce in her beliefs, and Sophie, calm and measured, trying to find the middle ground. Ethan realized that his loyalty was being pulled in two different directions. He cared about Anna, he liked her, admired her conviction, but he also cared deeply for his aunt and uncle, who had given him a place to stay, a roof over his head, and an opportunity to help. He couldn't just choose one over the other, not without considering the consequences. The farm wasn't just a place, it was a foundation for everything his family had built. But Anna's cause wasn't something he could ignore either. She had opened his eyes to the bigger picture, to the broader environmental implications of the GM crops. As he stood there, feeling the cool evening breeze on his face, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the same person he had been when he arrived on the farm. This summer, these experiences, the people he had met, had changed him. And whether he liked it or not, he was now a part of something bigger than himself. A conflict that had no easy answers, and that would require more than just surface-level decisions. Ethan couldn't ignore the truth. He was stuck between two worlds, each pulling him in different directions. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing. He had to make a choice. And it was a choice he couldn't delay any longer. Chapter 7. A tough decision. The days leading up to the weekend were heavy with tension. Ethan had been wrestling with his thoughts, torn between his loyalties to his family and his growing connection to the protesters, especially Anna. His relationship with Sophie had deepened, but his unease with the unfolding situation had only grown stronger. Every task he completed on the farm, every chore he did alongside his uncle and aunt, felt like a reminder of the growing divide between them. The farm had become more than just a place. It was a symbol of everything he was trying to reconcile. And every day, the pressure mounted as he found himself stuck between two worlds. It was Friday evening when everything finally came to a head. Ethan had spent the entire day in the fields with Uncle Frank, fixing up the fence near the vegetable patch, replacing boards and nails, working from dawn until dusk. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the fields, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of his indecision pressing down on him. He had seen Anna earlier in the week. She had approached him after the protest, telling him that she was planning something bigger. The protesters were organizing another event, one that would disrupt more than just the local farms. They were planning to take action directly against the Laddox farm, where the GM crops were being grown. They intended to sabotage the crops again, in a more dramatic move, hoping to make a stronger statement against the genetically modified crops. Anna had asked Ethan to join them, promising that they would stop the destruction before it went too far, but still, it was dangerous. It was illegal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan found himself standing alone in the middle of the fields, looking out over the land. The wind was calm, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the sheep and the rustling of leaves in the trees. He could see the farmhouse in the distance, the warm light shining from the windows, and for a moment, he thought about everything he had learned since arriving. He thought about his aunt and uncle, their dedication, the struggles they had faced to build the farm from the ground up. He thought about how important this place was to them, and how much it meant to him, too, now that he had spent time here, getting to know the land and the people who lived on it. But then his thoughts turned to Anna, standing up for what she believed in, even when it meant putting herself at risk. Her passion was undeniable, and as much as Ethan tried to push it aside, he couldn't stop thinking about the fire in her eyes when she talked about the future of the land, the environment, and the threat she saw from GM crops. Her words had struck a chord with him, and deep down, he knew that she believed this was the right thing to do, even if it meant breaking the law. Ethan turned and walked slowly back to the farmhouse. His stomach churned as he entered the house, the familiar smells of dinner wafting through the air. Aunt Jenny was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, while Uncle Frank was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. It was peaceful, just as it had always been. But tonight it felt different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, something unspoken, yet present in the way they looked at him. "Ethan," Aunt Jenny said, looking up as he walked in, "we're having roasted chicken tonight, with some of our fresh vegetables. You'll like it. Come on, sit down." He sat at the table, but his appetite was nowhere to be found. He could barely focus on the meal, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Was he going to be part of this farm? Was he going to side with Anna and the protesters, or would he stay loyal to his family and their beliefs? Uncle Frank put down the newspaper and glanced at Ethan. "How's the farm work going? Everything good?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice flat. "It's fine." Aunt Jenny looked at him carefully. "You don't seem happy, Ethan. Is something bothering you?" Ethan hesitated, his thoughts tangled. He could tell his aunt and uncle were trying to make him feel at home, trying to make this farm his home, but it was hard. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. The farm was peaceful, but it felt like a place trapped in time, a place that couldn't grow with the world as it changed. The protesters were fighting for change, real, immediate change. But was it the right way? Was it the right thing to do? Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about the protest," Ethan said, his voice low. "I think I'm starting to understand why they're doing what they're doing, but I don't know if I agree with the way they're going about it. It's It's complicated. His aunt and uncle exchanged a look, and Uncle Frank spoke up. We know it's a tough situation, son. We've been doing this for years, trying to keep the farm going, trying to make it work. But these GM crops are a real threat to everything we've built. I don't know what the future holds for farms like ours if things keep going the way they are. Ethan could feel the weight of their words. His uncle wasn't just talking about crops. He was talking about their life, their future. This was more than just a farm. It was their legacy. I understand, Ethan said quietly. I get what you're saying. I really do. But then, there's Anna and the protesters. They think that if we don't do something now, it'll be too late. They're fighting for what they believe is right, even if it means breaking the law. Aunt Jenny set her fork down, her face serious. I don't want you involved in that, Ethan. I know you're young, and you want to be part of something. But there's no coming back from something like that. The police, the law, once you're in, you can't get out. You'll regret it. I don't want you getting caught up in something that could ruin everything for you, for us, for your future. Ethan looked at his aunt, the woman who had taken him in when he needed a place to stay. She wasn't just a mother figure. She was the backbone of this farm. His loyalty to her and Uncle Frank was strong, but at the same time, Anna's words echoed in his mind. The protesters, the need for action, the passion for change. Wasn't that worth fighting for? I don't know what to do, Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. I feel like I'm stuck. If I choose Anna's side, I'm turning my back on you. If I stay here, I'm not helping fight for what I believe is right. Uncle Frank sighed deeply. Son, sometimes doing the right thing means making tough decisions. But you don't have to make this choice alone. You're part of this family now, and no matter what you decide, you've got us behind you. Ethan's heart ached as he heard his uncle's words. He was part of the family. He wasn't sure if he deserved that, if he had earned it. But in that moment, he realized how much he wanted to live up to their trust. Later that evening, after dinner, Ethan walked outside into the cool night air. The sky was dark, and the stars above seemed to shimmer with an almost eerie intensity. He stood there for a while, alone, thinking. The farm was peaceful, yes, but Anna's passion had lit a fire inside him that he couldn't ignore. He thought about her again, the way she believed in the cause, the way she had stood up for what she thought was right. Could he really turn his back on her and everything she stood for? But as he looked out over the quiet farm, the calmness of the fields, and the house nestled against the hill, he felt a deep connection to this place. This was where he had found some peace. This was where he had started to feel like he belonged. Ethan knew he couldn't stay in the middle forever. The time had come for him to make a decision. The question now was, what would that decision be? Chapter 8. The Storm. Ethan woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. It had rained heavily throughout the night, the sound of the downpour tapping against the windowsill like a constant drumbeat. The storm outside seemed to reflect the storm, brewing inside his mind. It was as if nature itself was mirroring his turmoil, his indecision. His thoughts about Anna, the protest, and the farm's future had only grown more complex. There was no clear answer, no easy solution. The farmhouse felt unusually quiet that morning, and as Ethan walked into the kitchen, he found Aunt Jenny at the stove, making breakfast. The smell of eggs and toast filled the air, and the warmth of the kitchen was a welcome contrast to the damp chill outside. "Good morning," Aunt Jenny said without looking up, her voice warm but tired. "How are you feeling today?" Ethan stood still, for a moment, unsure how to respond. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing that he couldn't avoid it any longer. I don't know," he finally said, sitting down at the table. "I can't stop thinking about everything. The protest, Anna. What should I do?" Aunt Jenny turned from the stove, her face serious now. "I know it's been a lot for you, Ethan. You're caught in the middle of something big, and it's not easy. But you have to remember, sometimes things aren't black and white. People are passionate, yes, but that doesn't always make them right." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. He knew she was right, but the weight of the choice he had to make felt unbearable. If he sided with Anna, he would be betraying his family's trust. But if he stayed loyal to the farm, he might be closing his eyes to a larger problem. It felt as though no matter what he chose, he was going to lose something important. "Do you think Anna's right?" Ethan asked quietly, his eyes focused on the table. Aunt Jenny hesitated, setting the spatula down and sitting across from him. "I don't know, Ethan. I'm not an expert on GM crops, and I'm not saying they're perfect. But we've worked hard to make this farm what it is, and we have to protect it. I understand why people like Anna are angry, but sometimes the way they go about things isn't the answer." Ethan ran his fingers over the edge of the table, the smooth surface cool beneath his touch. He wanted to be able to choose a side, to make things clear, but the lines between right and wrong felt blurry. As much as he wanted to believe in Anna's cause, he knew the consequences of taking drastic actions. He knew how much his aunt and uncle had invested in this farm, and he couldn't ignore that. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, the door slammed open, and Uncle Frank entered, dripping wet from the rain. His boots squelched on the floor as he shook off the water, his expression grim. "There's a storm rolling in," Uncle Frank said, looking directly at Ethan. "We're going to have to move quickly if we want to secure the fields before the worst of it hits." Ethan's thoughts were interrupted, but the urgency in his uncle's voice brought him back to the present. It didn't matter what was happening with the protests or his internal struggles. Nature had its own plans, and the storm that was coming was a force neither he nor anyone else could control. After breakfast, the three of them set out into the rain, moving quickly to check on the farm's fences to make sure everything was secure. The wind was howling now, and the rain seemed to pour sideways, stinging their skin as they worked. Ethan followed his uncle around the property, his thoughts still churning. He had no time to dwell on his confusion. He had to focus on the tasks at hand. The storm had started to intensify as they worked, and soon it was impossible to hear anything over the sound of the wind and the rain pounding against the earth. By mid-afternoon, the storm had reached its full force. The power went out, plunging the farmhouse into an eerie darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the emergency lanterns they kept in the kitchen. Ethan felt a rising sense of panic as he helped secure the last of the doors and windows. The storm wasn't just a passing shower. It was turning into something much more violent, and the wind was beginning to tear through the trees around the property. It felt like everything was being shaken up. Not just the land, but the life he had built here in the past few weeks. His thoughts turned again to Anna and the protest. She was out there somewhere in this storm, likely still standing. Firm in her beliefs, still fighting for what she thought was right. But as the wind howled louder and the rain lashed against the walls of the farmhouse, Ethan began to wonder if he was ready to face the consequences of following her cause. Could he really do it? Could he leave the farm and the people who had taken him in? The storm outside mirrored the chaos he was feeling inside. "Ethan!" Aunt Jenny's voice cut through his thoughts. She was standing in the doorway looking out at the storm. "We need to check on the animals before the worst of it hits. You and Uncle Frank go ahead. I'll stay inside and keep the house secure." Ethan nodded and quickly joined his uncle outside, bracing himself against the wind. The sky had darkened even further, the clouds swirling like something out of a nightmare. The field stretched out before him, bathed in the flickering light of the lanterns they carried. "I'll take care of the chickens," Uncle Frank said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You check on the sheep and make sure they're secure in the barn." Ethan nodded and set off toward the barn, his heart pounding as the rain soaked through his jacket. Every step felt like it took him deeper into the storm, into the chaos of the world outside. The rain was relentless now, and the wind was so strong that it felt like the earth itself was being pulled up from underneath him. He reached the barn, and as he opened the door, a powerful gust of wind slammed it back against the wall. Inside, the sheep huddled together, clearly spooked by the storm. Ethan quickly went to work, locking the doors and making sure the barn was secure. But then, as he worked, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A figure was standing just outside the barn, silhouetted against the flickering lantern. Light. At first, Ethan thought it was just the storm playing tricks on him, but then he saw it clearly. There, standing in the rain, was Anna. "Anna?" Ethan called out, stepping toward her through the rain-soaked mud. She didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, drenched, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, the storm seemed to fall silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "What are you doing here?" Ethan shouted over the wind. "You shouldn't be out in this storm. It's too dangerous." Anna stepped closer, her face determined but soft. "I had to come. I know you're confused. I know you're caught between two worlds. But you have to choose. You have to decide what kind of future you want to fight for." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The words she spoke felt like a challenge, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. "I don't know if I can make that choice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can be part of this, but I can't ignore what's happening either." The wind picked up again, the rain lashing harder against the barn. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking at Anna, unsure of what to say or do. Then, "Come with me," Anna said, her voice fierce. We can make a difference, Ethan. Together. But you have to decide now. Ethan stood frozen, caught between two worlds. The storm raging around him, the future uncertain. He didn't know what he would do, but in that moment, he knew that whatever choice he made would shape the rest of his life. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point. The storm had passed by the time Ethan woke the next morning. The early sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting a warm glow on the drenched fields, now eerily quiet. The wind had calmed, and the only sound was the soft drip of water from the trees, as if the earth itself was taking a slow breath after the chaos. But inside, Ethan's mind was far from peaceful. The events of the night before, Anna's appearance in the storm, the things she said, the promise she had asked of him, had left him feeling more unsettled than ever. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so torn. The choice he was being asked to make wasn't just about what side he wanted to take. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be. Anna had given him an ultimatum in the rain, her voice desperate but resolute. "You have to decide now," she had told him. "You can't stay in the middle forever. What future do you want to fight for?" It was those words that had echoed in his head all night. The question felt like a weight pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He knew that he couldn't keep avoiding this decision, but no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he wanted to silence the voice in his head, he couldn't. Stop thinking about Anna's plea, her cause, her belief in what she was doing. It was passionate and unwavering, and in some strange way it resonated with him. But could he really walk away from the farm, from his aunt and uncle? Could he betray the people who had given him a place to stay, a home when he had nowhere else to go? By the time he trudged downstairs, the house felt unusually silent. Aunt Jenny was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but her movements were slow, heavy, as if she too felt the weight of the previous day's events. Uncle Frank was nowhere to be found. Ethan guessed he was out tending to the animals, making sure everything was stable after the storm. "Morning," Ethan said quietly, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Morning, Ethan," Aunt Jenny replied, though she didn't look up from the stove. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Aunt Jenny's eyes flickered over to him. "You don't look all right. You've been distant lately. It's more than just the work. What's going on?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to. Tell her the truth. Not yet. Not now. He couldn't. But as he stood there, torn between the life he had come to know and the life that was calling to him from beyond the farm, he realized something. He couldn't keep hiding his thoughts, his feelings, not from her, not anymore. "I've been thinking a lot," he began slowly, his voice almost shaking, "about Anna and the protest, and everything that's been happening here. It's hard, Aunt Jenny. I'm trying to figure out where I belong in all of this." Aunt Jenny set the spatula down and turned to face him fully. Her expression was softer now, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. "I know it's been hard, but you need to understand something, Ethan. This farm is our life. Your uncle and I, We've put everything we have into it. And it's not just about crops or money. It's about who we are. This is where we belong. Ethan's chest tightened as he listened to her, and for a moment he felt guilty for even questioning it. He had spent so many mornings helping them, and every time he worked alongside his aunt and uncle, it felt like he was part of something important. This was a place of hard work and dedication, of care and tradition. It was a life that was rooted in the earth, a life that felt timeless. But that was the problem. Everything was so deeply rooted here, so unchanging. How could he choose this over something that was calling him to change? "I know, Aunt Jenny," Ethan said, his voice strained. "But I can't ignore what Anna and the others are fighting for. I understand why they're doing what they're doing, even if it's dangerous. They believe it's the only way to protect the land, to stop things from getting worse. They're willing to take risks. And Aunt..." Jenny cut him off, her voice tight. "And what? You think they're right? You think you should join them?" Ethan looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting nervously. "I don't know what to think anymore. I can see both sides, but I can't keep living in the middle. I have to make a choice." Aunt Jenny's face softened, but her eyes were filled with concern. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. "Ethan, you're young. You're going to face a lot of hard choices in your life. But remember this, sometimes the hardest thing to do is stand up for what you believe, even if it means going against the people you love." For a moment, the ET words hung in the air between them, and Ethan could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. Could he really choose between the people he loved and the cause he believed in? Was it even possible to have both? Aunt Jenny turned back to the stove, picking up the spatula once more. "Think about it, Ethan. Whatever you decide, we'll still love you, but you need to think about the future, about where you see yourself, and you need to make that decision soon." Ethan nodded, though the storm in his mind was far from settled. He couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Something had to give. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing on the edge of the farm, looking out over the valley. The skies were clear now, the rain having passed, and the sun was casting long shadows across the land. The scene before him was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The fields stretched out before him, the crops swaying gently in the breeze, and the sheep were grazing calmly, unaware of the storm that had passed and the storm that still loomed within Ethan himself. He thought about Anna and the look in her eyes when she had asked him to join her in the protest. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the rain, as if she needed him by her side, as if she believed he was the one who could make the difference. The thought lingered, pulling at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. But he also thought about his aunt and uncle, their hard work, their quiet determination. They had been here for so long, and they had fought to build this farm from the ground up. The farm wasn't just their livelihood, it was their legacy, their identity. As the sun began to set, casting the fields in a golden light, Ethan knew that his decision was coming soon. He couldn't keep running from it, couldn't keep pretending, like he didn't have to choose. The breaking point was here. In that moment, Ethan realized something important. Whatever choice he made, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he had learned from the people around him, about the lessons he had picked up on this farm, about the passion and conviction that Anna had shown him. The future wasn't something that would just happen. It was something he had to fight for, but the fight had to start with one decision. Chapter 10. Moving on. The days following Ethan's decision were some of the most challenging yet. The weight of the choice he had made hung over him, like a shadow that he couldn't shake. There was no going back. He had decided to stay with his family, to help on the farm, and to remain loyal to the life that had given him stability and purpose. But even as he worked side by side with Aunt Jenny and Uncle Frank, something inside him felt different. He knew he had chosen the path of tradition and responsibility, but the pull of the protest, the call for change, still lingered in his heart. The morning after he made his choice, the sun rose early, casting a soft light across the fields. Ethan stood at the window of his room, looking out over the land that had become so familiar to him in the last few weeks. The quiet of the early morning was peaceful, but there was a restlessness within him that wouldn't let him fully embrace the calm. "Hey, Ethan," Uncle Frank called from downstairs, his voice carrying up the staircase. "Breakfast is ready. Get moving. There's a lot of work to do today." Ethan sighed, brushing his hair back as he turned away from the window. He had spent the night thinking about everything: Anna, the protest, the future, and the farm. But now it was time to face the reality of his decision. He met his uncle in the kitchen, where Aunt Jenny was setting the table. The smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling bacon filled the room, the familiar comforts of home. But today, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. He felt both part of this world and yet, in some ways, distant from it. "Good morning, Ethan," Aunt Jenny said with a warm smile, though her eyes seemed a little tired. "How are you feeling today?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the table. I'm okay. Just a little tired, I guess." His aunt and uncle exchanged a brief glance but said nothing. They had both known that the choice would be difficult for him, and now that it was made, they respected his decision. But they could tell that something was still bothering him, even if he wasn't ready to talk about it. As they ate breakfast, the conversation flowed as it always did, filled with talk of the weather, the crops, and the day's work ahead. Yet, there was an undercurrent of tension. Ethan found himself zoning out, his thoughts drifting as he stared at the plate in front of him. He knew that his decision had affected more than just him. It had changed the dynamic of his relationship with Anna, and it had shifted his place within the family. There was no going back, but that didn't make it any easier. After breakfast, Ethan and Uncle Frank went out to the fields. They needed to check on the irrigation system, as the rain from the storm had caused some issues with the water flow. As they worked, Ethan's mind wandered again. His uncle worked with a quiet efficiency, the years of experience showing in his every movement. He seemed at ease, content with the life they had built here. Ethan admired that, but he couldn't deny the growing ache in his chest, the feeling that he was letting go of something important, something he wasn't sure he fully understood. Yet. Ethan, Uncle Frank said, breaking the silence between them. I know it wasn't an easy decision for you, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the way you've handled everything. It's not always easy to follow in someone's footsteps, but sometimes that's what we need to do. We do it because we believe in what we're building here. Ethan stopped for a moment, the words sinking in. He had always admired his uncle's strength, the way he could work tirelessly without complaining, without hesitation. But Ethan wasn't sure he was cut from the same cloth. He didn't have the same certainty that Uncle Frank had about the farm, about staying rooted in tradition. He couldn't help but wonder if in a few years he would look back on this moment with regret, wondering what would have happened if he had chosen a different path. I know, Ethan replied quietly. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Uncle Frank looked at him, his expression softening. Son, there's no right or wrong in a decision like this. You make the best choice you can, and you live with it. That's all anyone can do. Ethan nodded, but the words didn't fully ease the turmoil inside him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that no matter what he did, there would always be something missing. He had made his choice to stay, but part of him would always wonder what would have happened if he had gone with Anna, if he had fought for the future she believed in. Later that afternoon, Ethan was working near the vegetable garden when a familiar voice called out to him. Ethan, can I talk to you for a minute? He turned around to see Anna standing at the edge of the garden, drenched from the rain, but with a determined look on her face. For a moment, Ethan felt his heart race, but he quickly masked his emotions. He had made his decision, and he couldn't let her pull him back into the conflict. Not now. Not after everything he had worked through. Anna, he said, his voice tight, what are you doing here? Anna stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. I needed to see you, she said. I know you made your choice, but I had to know if you were okay. I don't want you to regret it, Ethan. I don't want you to look back in a few years and wish you had joined us. Ethan's heart twisted in his chest. He had been avoiding this conversation for days, but now here she was, standing in front of him, asking the very question that had been eating at him. Was he okay? Was he really okay with his decision? I don't know, Anna, he said, his voice softer than he intended. It's hard. I thought I knew what I wanted, but now I'm not so sure. I don't regret my decision, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something missing. Anna's face softened, and for a moment they just stood there. In silence, both of them caught in the weight of their emotions. Ethan could feel the distance between them, the divide that had grown since he made his choice. He had chosen the farm, the life he had grown to love, but part of him couldn't let go of the passion Anna had shown, the fire in her eyes when she talked about fighting for change. He admired that, and he couldn't completely silence the voice in his mind that wondered if he had made a mistake. I understand, Anna said, her voice low. I know it's not easy, Ethan. But just remember, you made the choice that's right for you. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away from what you love for what you believe in. Ethan looked at her, her words sinking in. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about choosing the right or wrong side. It was about what felt right for him, what he believed was worth fighting for. "I'll be okay," Ethan said quietly, finally letting go of the guilt he had been carrying. "I think I needed to hear that. I think I just needed to accept my decision." Anna nodded, a small, understanding smile on her face. "You will. But if you ever want to fight for change, if you ever want to take a stand with us, you know where to find us." Ethan watched as she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the distance. For the first time in days, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had made his decision, and while it wasn't easy, it was his. He would never forget the lessons he had learned from Anna and the protesters, but he knew now that his place was here, with his family and the farm. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land, Ethan stood at the edge of the fields, looking out at the horizon. The sky was a mix of oranges and purples, the calm after the storm. The wind had died down, and the land seemed peaceful again. He wasn't sure what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever see Anna again, or if he would find himself questioning his decision. But for the first time in weeks, he felt at peace with where he was. He had chosen to stay, and he would make the best of it. The storm had passed, and now it was time to move on. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.